Hi, everyone. Welcome to our live interview today, and thank you for joining us. It's great to see leaders tuning in from across regions, sectors, and disciplines. My name is Bhuva Shakti. I'm the Chief Ethics and Culture Officer at Women in AI. I'm really glad to be joined today by Steph Wright, the co founder and CEO of our AI collective. Women in AI is a global nonprofit working to advance inclusive leadership, responsible innovation, and ethical governance in artificial intelligence. We are a team of volunteers spread across 170 plus countries, and I cannot do what I do without my team's support every single day. In my role as the Chief Ethics and Culture Officer at Women in AI focus at the intersection of ethics, culture, and leadership accountability globally across every country we operate. Much of my work centers on helping corporations and C suite leaders navigate AI transformation, even when AI is not their core business, and supporting startups in embedding governance, risk, and compliance early so AI readiness is built in from the start. I see firsthand how ethical AI decisions are shaped as much by culture and judgment as by technology. I'm delighted to be joined today by Steph Wright, one of the top 10 women in tech in Scotland and one of the 100 billionth women in AI ethics. A leader and advocate for ethical, inclusive, and responsible AI, she was instrumental in the development and delivery of Scotland's first national AI strategy. Steph's community, our AI collective, is a nonprofit dedicated to building a world where AI is shaped by people and technology reflects diverse values to protect rights and strengthen democracy. I titled our conversation today as AI for Good versus Profit, Ethics, Culture, and Community Power. As AI becomes more embedded across industries and societies, a deeper tension is becoming impossible to ignore. Who benefits from AI and who gets left out? Incentives are shaping decisions, profit is accelerating deployment, and yet the voices of communities most impacted by these systems are often missing. Today's discussion is about understanding that imbalance and what it takes to shift from AI that is driven only by markets to AI that is shaped by people, values, and shared accountability. Let's get started. Hi, Steph. Welcome to our call.
Hello, how are you? Nice to see everyone.
Thanks for joining us today. So, when we say AI for good versus profit, what specific decisions or trade offs are leaders actually making behind the scenes? Can you give us a concrete example?
We're diving straight in there with the deep. Yeah, no, well, I talk about AI for good quite a lot because I think personally, from a personal perspective, the very concept of AI for good is quite weird for me because surely all AI should be for good. That should be
Yeah,
the default. Because by actually specifically calling out AI for good, does that mean that the default is AI for bad, AI for profit, AI for this? Because, I find that narrative quite strange. Because, like I said, that implies that the default isn't AI for good. Um, and we need to call out examples for AI for good. And it is one of these, where I think, actually calling out AI for bad, AI for evil, AI for profit, or whatever, kind of that's more impactful than the concept of AI for good, because I think AI for good in general has been perhaps usurped by a lot of performative ethics, a lot of performative goodness, because at the end of the day, AI is for profit at the moment. In general, it is because it is profit that drives the narratives behind AI, and I'm very passionate about challenging some of those narratives because, like you said, when we talk about, the benefits of AI, who benefits from AI, and who's harmed, and whose benefits are at the cost of someone else, who benefits and at whose detriment, and that's like a perfect example to this entire discussion. A concrete example for AI for profit is pretty much the entire AI industry right now. I
Yeah.
mean, on a very basic level, right? I just think of the amount of investment going into AI. Just think what that level of investment can actually do to solve some of the world's greatest problems, the wicked problems. The poverty, access to education, access to water, access to digital, in general, as a level playing field. If you last month at the was it last month or was it earlier this month? I can't remember now. At the AI India Summit, someone said, "Oh yeah, in the future, everyone will have access to an AI agent." I'm kind of like, and I was talking with some colleagues, and we're like, well, I'm looking forward to a future where everyone has access to their human rights first before they get access to an AI agent. But if we want to stay in the tech world, how about everyone has access to digital, as access to
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
internet? And there we are. We're already like leaping into something that the truth is half the world has no profit from, has no benefit from, and it's kind of been driven by a very small group. um I could go on all day, so maybe but yeah, because I just think technology should serve society and not the other way around, and it should be for the benefit of the most people as opposed to the few.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I couldn't agree more, especially if we don't label it as AI for good, is it going to be bad? If it's not good for the people that are using it, what kind of AI are we building, right? So that's a bigger question. And like you rightly
Well, you can
mentioned, there
argue
are,
that AI is for good. It is good
yeah,
for those making a profit from it right now, because it is good for the Nvidias, the OpenAIs, the Googles of this world, because it depends how you define good, who gets to define good.
yeah,
And yeah.
exactly. Yeah, and that's subjective and that's very regional. That's also evolving as people try to get access. But like you said, if digital access itself is a challenge, what are we talking about for AI agents in the future, right? So, baby steps. Now, we gave a little bit introduction about AI for good versus profit. Now, what are the underlying incentives that still prioritize profit? I mean, who truly owns AI today? The data, the models, the infrastructure.
Well, let's put it this way: it's not you or me.
It's not
It's
you and
not
me.
most of us. And that's the thing, right? The whole profit narrative. It is difficult to frame, because the truth is, life isn't black and white. There it's not that simple. There's many shades of gray. But the thing is, the whole profit thing, you can get attacked for viewing it as a bad thing. But we live, unfortunately, in a capitalist kind of like society, and making profit is one of the aims. So I to a certain degree, I can't begrudge companies doing what they're set up to do. But when there are technologies like AI around that could do a whole lot of stuff, that should not be your only driver. The bottom line should not be your only driver. What sells the most, etc. Like recently, last week, when we talk about, say, for example, social media, that groundbreaking, trial that found that yes, Meta, etc., and YouTube are guilty for creating addictive behaviors, and those
Mhm.
addictive behaviors are, they are powered by this need to continue engaging with platforms, because that's how you make a profit if people keep using your product, right? And so that's a perfect example of prioritizing profit over good. Because if Facebook really was about connecting you with your friends and your communities, it shouldn't need addictive behavioral, kind of altering algorithms to make you engage with it. But at the end of the day, it's an ad platform, kind of
Yeah.
thing, because they sell ads, because that's their business model. And so this is like, at a very basic level, that is, it's kind of profit driven, right? And but the thing is, we have these sets of technologies that could do amazing things, but right now it's about who can make the most money from it. And by God, it's a whole lot of money right now, that everyone's talking about, and ultimately it's this kind of circular investment scam, essentially, where people are throwing amounts like $500 billion around, or $100 billion, etc. And you're kind of looking at this and you're like, just think if we invested that in schools, in our healthcare systems, etc. Surely that is more for good than it is that to make a small amount of people very wealthy. And yeah, I mean, I can go into deep kind of conversations about whether we should have billionaires, whether there should be people that are so crazily wealthy that it's beyond like the reps, the kind of reach of the majority of people on this planet, whilst there are people who are dying and suffering and stuff. So if we live in our own little bubble, we have this immense privilege to be in a situation where we can discuss, oh, should AI be the thing, or AI for profit be the thing, or be able to talk about the trade-offs and etc. But who are we to make those decisions that somehow we are more valued than others, that our use for these technologies is more important than others? And every time people talk about AI for good, efficiency gains, productivity gains, for whose benefit and at whose detriment, right? And who takes the risk for your gain, and it is, and what gives you the right to make that decision, kind of thing. What gives any of us the right to decide that a particular town in Chile's water needs are not as important as the data center that's going to get built there, and I think all these things, it's just all complicated, I think, at the end of the day, and it's challenging, and a lot of people aren't even aware of it, and I think that's a problem, because the concepts of like literacy, data and AI literacy, is all very focused on skills acquisition in order to do specific roles, or to use specific tools. But really, literacy should expand beyond that to understand the wider context that all this lives in, because otherwise we end up being a global society that only focuses on their own little thing, and damned be everyone else. And I'm not sure about you, but that's not the kind of world I want to live in. That's not the kind of world I want my children to grow up in, because at the end of the day, that what's wrong with wanting to help other people? What's wrong with, being able to share the benefits of any particular discovery or invention, etc.? Because surely we'll all be better for it. And that might be very naive, but I like to think there is that possibility, there is that world, and AI and technologies like AI can play a role in it.
Yeah, I don't want to live in that kind of world, or not my children, but definitely I understand where collective ownership, and also that's why I talk about ethics and culture together sometimes, because what looks good for one set of community may not be the
Mhm.
right thing for the another set of community, right? So who benefits economically and socially should be very directly related to the community and their needs.
Mhm.
But it's not the ideal world we are in today. Currently, we have AI systems that concentrate power. When this concentration of power happens, leaving out communities and their needs and their economic and social needs away from the realities of life, what do you think are the second order effects on really smaller economies, the Chile example that you gave, right? So, similar to that, what are some second order effects like this on smaller economies or communities or even public institutions to a certain extent?
Well, you see, I think the concentration of power is kind of bolstered up by the dominant narratives around
Yeah.
AI at the moment. And I speak to so many people who feel like they don't have a choice, they don't have a say, they have no power, and and it's inevitable. This is something I am very passionate about, which is countering those narratives of inevitability. There's this
Mm.
brilliant work I'm doing with a fantastic organization called We in AI. We wrote a paper at the end of last year around countering those narratives of inevitability through refusal, reclaiming, reimagining, and resistance. And this is a growing movement. There are growing examples of this around the world, because that dominant narrative of it's happening, you have no say, you better get with it or you get left behind. That's the
Hmm.
common one, right? And
Yeah.
we don't like narratives of fear, right? Surely progress shouldn't be driven by narratives of fear. You'll be left behind, you'll miss out, etc. And Rachel Caldecott, she says FOMO is not a strategy, I'm a big believer in that. FOMO shouldn't be a strategy in your life or your business, and
Yeah.
it is one of these, and those power structures that keep that narrative out there is so pervasive, it's so strong. And I get it, and I totally get it. And but at the end of the day, right, AI isn't like, the people calling it, like, it's not, I always say it's not an unstoppable force. It's not like a tornado you can't prevent or an earthquake you can't prevent. you know
Yeah.
AI, the world of AI, any technology is the result of human choices. And because they are choices, they can be changed, they can be affected. And I know sometimes it feels like that's not possible. And if we all subscribe to that, it's not possible, it's an unstoppable force, we can't change it, then we will hurtle towards a future that I'm not sure many of us would want to be in. And therefore, I always claim, what I'm trying to do with the RAI Collective is trying to empower people to reclaim that power, to kind of,
Hmm.
you know to build the capacity and the knowledge to reclaim that power, to challenge that power, to challenge those narratives, to ask the questions, to go, what is this, what does it do for me, kind of thing. And how can we do this differently? Because I think we can do different things differently. There are examples of things around the world. And in the paper we had examples of different forms of resistance, refusal, reimagining, and reclaiming. I wrote a bit about reclaiming. I covered a couple of examples from around the world. One is, the Maori language model from Tahiku Media. That was, a project, language model built to preserve the Maori language for
Yeah.
the Maori people, and it is, and its licensing of its use, etc. And the data all belongs to the Maori community. It doesn't belong to OpenAI. It doesn't belong to Google. It doesn't belong to Microsoft. There's also like an initiative in Africa, Masakani, which is about African language models for Africans by Africans. So there are pockets of different things around the world. So we're trying to gather together, a kind of database of all these examples, because sometimes it could feel like it's quite hopeless. What's the point? Kind of thing. What can little old me do? But I think little old me can do something. Everyone can. There is collective power. There is, collective intelligence that can be put onto this. Just be, and a lot of the narratives also is that AI is too complicated. You won't understand. Kind of thing. That all feeds into that whole, how to retain the existing power structures, right? And I mentioned the idea of performative ethics earlier, where consult the community, tick,
Yeah.
kind of thing,
Yeah.
where people are brought in, and it's not about sharing the power. It's about validating decisions that have already been made. And you're like, that's performative, because you're not sharing the power, you're not giving any form of agency to people other than to say whether they think what you've already decided is like good or not.
Yeah.
And the likelihood of you actually changing a course because people said it isn't good doesn't matter, unless you genuinely believe, hey, therefore that means our product isn't going to sell. Then that's a different matter, right? Because that once again goes back to that profit benchmark. Are we going to make money from this? So I don't know, I'm kind of going on a bit of a tangent now, but the whole power structures thing, it's so key, because ultimately technology is about power. Who has it, who hasn't got it, who wants it, and who shouldn't have it. And I think that's and it's not unique to AI. Yes, of course AI has been around since the 50s, and AI means many different things, it means many different technologies. But around data, around any form of technology, these conversations are recurring, around power, and the kind of distribution of it and the unevenness of it. And you know here we are today. AI is the latest example, and and it's kind of it's kind of exemplified in a lot of the kind of challenges that we have now around it. And yeah, it is all, it is all difficult. And I think at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge we can't go down the route of, oh, it's just a tool, it's just a technology, because it is not that. It is much more complicated than that, and it exists within an entire system, of many different things, of culture, of governance, of community, of social norms and social contracts, of politics, of economic theory, of philosophy, everything. It's that to kind of just reduce it to one thing, therefore gives you a bit of a get out of jail card, I think, to kind of like not think
Yeah,
about these other things. But we can't do that, because we have to recognize that if we just ignore all that stuff, it shows that you're in a position of privilege, because you have to be privileged to be able to ignore all that stuff, because there are many people that have, you know things like AI done to them, not with them,
yeah, not have the
and not
privilege.
by them.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it is that, talk about, lack of equity in this world, like, the global power imbalances, etc. It all ties into that, and AI is a factor in that. Technologies like that can, exacerbate, support, proliferate some of these power imbalances.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I couldn't agree more, especially like you mentioned, we're not talking about a tornado or something like that that we can't prevent. It's something that is made out of our own choices. So if we are able to consult with our communities where the change really affects or affects, then that's going to better serve. And like you mentioned, instead of trying to talk about the inevitability, as a community, collective power can reimagine some of this. I mean, it's all a start, right? Baby steps, like I mentioned earlier. And something that you mentioned about performative ethics also resonated with me, because any business, AI for profit or whatever that is about meeting customer needs, right? So if you're developing AI that doesn't serve the needs of your people, how do you think that's going to evolve or continue to collaborate or connect people, right? So it also makes business sense to ensure that you engage communities where you do something with AI so that they are also included in the conversation. This also brings me to a point where you helped shape a national AI strategy in Scotland. And what is one assumption about AI development today that you believe is fundamentally flawed or dangerous? And when you were trying to shape this national AI strategy in Scotland, where do you think national strategies fall short when they move from, there are policies on paper, but when it becomes real world implementation, there are challenges, right? So, how do people approach it when you put something on paper, but there are challenges translating it in the real world?
Well, everything always looks better on paper, right? So you actually
Yeah,
have to deliver it. I mean, I can only obviously comment on the first national AI strategy in Scotland. There's now been a new strategy launched, but when we developed the first strategy in Scotland, this was pre-generative AI days. We started the process in 2019, and and we were meant to launch it in 2020, but we all know what happened in 2020. The world literally turned upside down, and
yeah,
and so we ended up launching it in 2021. And the AI world has changed massively since our strategy came out. And the vision in the strategy was centered on trust, ethics, and inclusion, because at the time we felt that that was the aim to go for. That's the vision, right?
mhm,
That's what we should strive to do, because at that time we could see all these amazing examples of how AI could do real good,
yeah,
and we had case studies, etc. Obviously, everything changed. I think once the generative AI bomb hit the world, everyone, well, for starters, everyone was more aware of what AI is, although with perhaps a slightly skewed understanding, because I think a lot of people now just equate AI with ChatGPT or Gemini.
ChatGPT is
But
AI.
you and I know, and anyone else who works in AI that is but one of the many things that the term AI is an umbrella for, and
Yeah.
and and it is, and I get it. It's really easy to get caught up in the hype, the excitement. Yes, it is cool. It's exciting, right? It is, and all of a sudden you could see all these things where you're like, whoa, whoa! It could totally change how we do work, and then people have just dived straight into it, right? Because it's exciting, because it's shiny, because the truth is the things that are most important are actually kind of boring, right? Like, the
Yeah.
I remember once being asked on a panel, um, where it was a panel around innovation in healthcare or someone, and someone said, what would be the one thing that would be the best ROI for any organization right now? And other panelists were like, "Oh yeah, blockchain, AI, and this." And I said, "I'm going to get the most boring answer because I'm going to say infrastructure, right? Because making systems that actually talk to each other and actually function well, and stuff like that, and that." In essence, is the challenge, right? That the new shiny thing always sounds more exciting and more doable than fixing the underlying problems. I mentioned earlier that the fundamental problems that we face in organizations, in public sector, in academia, all the things that are the real problems that right now AI is promising itself to be a solution for, are not going to be fixed by technology, AI or not, because I think a lot of the times the key problems we have is under resourcing, lack of funding, poor management, poor policy, poor culture, kind of thing. And you need to fix that first before you think about a technological solution, because techno solutionism is rife, and AI has amplified that to the max. It's like, yeah, I'll sort that, because that's how it's being sold. It's being sold as this solution to all your problems. But the truth is, as anyone who works in AI knows, that what some of the best applications of AI is in very narrow, really well defined problem applications, right? And so and it's and a lot of global, I think a lot of global narratives around, from governments, is they don't want to be seen as the laggards, the ones who are not embracing technology. So everyone's
Yeah.
all in on this whole AI will bring us a world of abundance, because that's the dominant narrative. But I think yeah, that the aiming to be something and the reality of it hitting, when you're having to, I'm not going to say it's easy, right, to balance
Yeah.
all the different priorities which governments have, which organizations have. But at the heart of it, there needs to be that driving force of, how does this benefit as many people as possible, as opposed to making our lives easier, or enriching the few, kind of thing. It is difficult, and the whole global narrative from governments from everywhere has changed a lot, and I'm not going to lie, I imagine there's a lot of pressure from the private sector around a lot of these narrative changes. But I quite often say, look, what kind of a world do we want to build? What kind of a country do you want to have? Do you could have the dominant narratives around economic growth and increase in productivity. But for example, if those are your sole measures of a successful country, you could have a country that has like a really high GDP, and are the most productive, but you'll have the most miserable, unequal, burnt out
People.
society,
Yeah.
and is that what we want? So it is always, when we talk about growth for whom and for whose benefit, and is that benefit being distributed fairly across everyone? And productivity, the conversations around productivity are also challenging, because increase in productivity versus intensification of work, like, is being more productive, actually being is that good for you? Kind of thing. Like, because uh, someone I met recently, Will, Will from formerly of Spotify. He's an economist, and he was talking about Jevons paradox. The whole when it's an economic concept, about how when you make things more efficient, people think that you'll therefore use less of it. But that's not at all true. You're right. You make something more efficient, people do it more. People work harder. If for example, an AI assistant can make you get through your emails quicker, what do? You do more emails, kind of thing.
In many ways. Yeah.
And therefore, essentially, it's about extracting more labor from you for less, or for the same. And that's challenging. Is it good for us to the narrative around how AI tools could get rid of all the mundane, and the tedious tasks? That's the common narrative, isn't it? And you're like, by God, but if you get rid of all the mundane and the tedious tasks, then you only have the really mentally intensive tasks, right? And if that's all you have all day, what does that do to you as for
Yeah, the
well-being?
mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, an MSP once said to me, he's like, "Oh, I quite enjoy at the end of the day just like sticking stamps on envelopes because it helps me decompress. It helps me, relax at the end of the day." And so if we got rid of all those kind of tasks because they're seen as, oh yeah, you can then focus on more important tasks. It's like maybe that's not so good either. Like we will be very tired and very exhausted and very broken. That we won't have the capacity to go do the things that apparently these tools will free you up to do. Yeah, and I don't even remember, was it that post that kind of went viral where someone like, I envisaged a future where AI will do all the things I don't want to do, so I can go create art and paint and relax and stuff. But now what AI is being created is to create art, etc. And what's left for me to do is all the tedious things like my laundry and stuff like that. So it is kind of one of these, like, what the technology should serve society. What do we want the technologies to do? And is it about, making us, is it about helping us? Is it about replacing us? Is it about I don't know. It's just there's lots of big
Finding
questions.
the right balance.
It's about finding the right balance. Like I always say, look,
Yeah.
I'm not here to tell anyone whether to use AI or not, because who am I to tell them that? But I kind of think, everyone should at least be aware of the wider context in which these technologies exist, whether as an adopter or user or as a developer, because the whole, oh, I just write the code, it doesn't fly really when the thing that you write the code for could actively harm people. You don't get that get out of jail card. And like I said, the challenges around people not really understanding what AI is as well, because right now I think a majority of people think, associate AI with ChatGPT and Gemini and stuff. And as we know, there's many other AI technologies, and those other AI technologies have evidence of positive impacts and major breakthroughs, but they are different things. So you can't use, so for example, I always say you can't use AlphaFold as an excuse, as a get out of jail card for the fact that ChatGPT helped a teenager commit suicide. You just
Yeah.
can't do that because they are not the same thing. But by everyone just calling everything AI, you're trying to kind of create that atmosphere where you can. But people need to understand that AI is not one thing, and a one size fits all just isn't appropriate for it, I think. And it's about understanding what people are talking about when they say AI. And 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 I feel for all the AI engineers and researchers and stuff who've been in the field way before generative AI came on the scene,
Absolutely.
and now they're like, what about my AI? and and you know, and yeah, it is challenging, and I think it's dangerous as well because, like you said, when everyone is caught by this dominant narrative, then you're kind of making decisions that are perhaps not the most informed, that will have consequences later on, and a lot of things are kind of fueled by short-term thinking, you know, and although immediately you might not see any impacts, but down the line, when all of a sudden no one in your organization knows how to write an email anymore when Copilot goes down, you know,
That's
or
the
no
big
one can
problem.
understand a report anymore or analyze any data, or coders who can't actually code anymore because they've done the whole, AI coding thing. Yeah, there was this fantastic blog from a coder who said, I'm going all in on AI for 3 months. Let's see how it goes. And he said, fair enough. I shipped product quicker, etc. I did things quicker, but then the problems came when things didn't work, because then I
Mm-hmm.
realized I didn't actually code any of this. So I couldn't fix it, you know, and
Yeah,
and so that's like the whole short term, long term kind of thing, right? In the short term, yes, I shipped things quicker, got to MVP, whatever, quicker, went through more agile cycles. It was all quick. But then at the end, when it's like, oh, but what about this? And you're like, yeah, no, I didn't write this. Like, I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what it did here. And that's just like, if you kind of think of it on a superficial coding level, like, but what if that's like healthcare, you know?
yeah. Mm-hmm.
There was a paper recently, I think, or an article just last week about this whole, doctors using AI scribes, you know, uh, because that's the thing right now, AI scribes and GP appointments, so the GP can concentrate more on the relationship with the patient, etc. But this doctor said, yes, it did. I went back to talking to my patient and blah blah blah. But they said, actually, but then I realized I stopped curating the important stuff. I just let things ramble on. I didn't focus on what was important and stuff. And when I revisited the notes, I realized I didn't recognize it. I didn't write it. I didn't
Yeah.
curate what was important. Because it was just a verbatim transcript of what was discussed. And actually, that will end up being problematic, right? Like, nuance, emphasis, etc., that doctors would normally put in their own notes if they wrote it. And it's like, how do you balance that, right? How do you balance giving more time for a doctor to engage with the patient with actually, kind of absolving themselves from that responsibility, and therefore when they revisit it, they realized, oh, all of my expert curation of any of this is not there, kind of thing. So it is the whole short term versus long term. What how do we get that balance of making it, although it might be great now, it could be terrible, like, in 6 months time. um and then how can you fix it? Because by then maybe someone has completely de-skilled to the point that they can't fix it. You
Yeah, yeah. Finding that right balance in terms of, I mean, we are already, let's say, flying while designing, but also taking that time to see what are those manual tasks but are really essential for human well-being versus trying to automate everything. And then when there is a problem like the healthcare scenario you mentioned, it's really not about what's prescriptive, but also working with your patients to understand what their individual needs are, right? So if I didn't code, I didn't write, I didn't assess, I don't know how to fix it when it comes to problems, especially when it involves human well-being and health, right? And like you rightly mentioned, for the Scotland strategy, trust, ethics, inclusion are like basic principles. It's not only for AI. Instead of thinking AI as a technology, try to find problem areas in individual sectors and see where AI can help you enable efficiency and productivity, but also retain that human intelligence and problem solving, critical thinking skills, which are at the moment seem to be a lost art, right? So if you keep writing emails with an AI tool, you'll forget, like you said, at some point how to write emails when the need comes, right? So there are good benefits, there are bad scenarios, but then AI is not going anywhere, it's here. And community power is very compelling, and we can reimagine the inevitable, right? But then, what do you say to a CEO who believes that ethical or community and culture driven AI will reduce competitiveness or margins because everyone is getting ahead of the game. If a CEO or someone who runs a business or runs an institution or runs a government tries to step back to think about ethics, culture, and community, will they be left behind? What is the decision in terms of their competitiveness or getting ahead of their competitors?
Once again, it's that narrative you're saying, that whole you'll be left behind or
Yeah,
you'll lose out. And you're like, but what do you win? Are we really talking about it's that adversarial kind of narrative, right? Like if you don't do it, they will, you know.
yeah.
And it's like, what are we on a playground? Come on, like, a what are your company's values, right? As a CEO, what are your company's values? What are their strategies? What are their policies, etc. And how does any of this align with any of it? you know, um, it's sort of like I think a lot of challenges organizations have right now. They have a sustainability policy or commitment to reducing the carbon footprint, yet they're all like, oh yeah, go all out on generative AI. And you're like, what? It's like, and it is, look, like I said, companies exist to make a return for their investors, right? And that is their driver. And I get it that it's about, it is ultimately about profit and money in those situations. But creating products that are harmful for people and the planet aren't going to be beneficial in the long run, because we all live on this planet together. We all exist together as people. And if you're quite happy to continue harming people with this thing in order for your short-term returns, that there's not a lot someone like I can say about it. Anything I've said here would be completely irrelevant because it,
Yeah.
we obviously don't align, on values. But I like to think most people aren't like that at all, and that actually a lot of startups, a lot of people, a lot of engineers, all that, they want to do the right thing because we all recognize we're all on this planet together, right? You can only distance yourself from what happens in the world to a very small extent. It will eventually all catch up with us. If we burn this planet to the ground, you know, then there is no other. There is no other.
There
Um,
is no planet B. Yeah.
there is no planet B, and there is no. People lament the loss of the high street and lament the loss of banks and post offices and all these community resources. It's because of this relentless drive to for convenience and for digital. um I'm a big tech geek. I love technology, and I do believe that technology can do great things, but until we know that we have set the infrastructure up that everyone can benefit from it, we have to give people an element of choice. We have to have choice. And and you know and then going back to the whole CEO thing, a myth that always goes around is the whole regulation is a barrier to innovation. We've all heard that, right?
Yeah, blame it on the
All that from
regulation.
specific people, and it always makes me think, right? The people who say this, what are their motivations, right? Because for me, of course, I acknowledge there can be overregulation. There can be, too much red tape kind of thing, but in general, regulation is there to channel innovation safely, and as a developer, as an inventor, a creator, or whatever, why wouldn't you want to produce a product that is safe for people, that doesn't harm people? Because something that harms people ain't gonna sell, and so that it is what, or something that's of no use, or something that will damage, communities and environments and stuff. So that regulation is a myth to innovation, is a barrier to innovation, is a myth. It's a myth peddled by those people that serves, because you have regulations and standards for a thing. That's how you you know gain trust for your product and ensure that your product doesn't harm people or anything, but because why would you want to create things that harm people? Like,
Yeah, and your business objective is not going to be met because you'll not have people to serve and make profit from your business if you build something that doesn't benefit the people you serve, right?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, it is complicated, and we all operate from our echo chamber and our environment and our privilege, and I totally get that. But those not from that same privilege and not from that worldview, those voices are severely underrepresented and completely missing from a lot of these conversations. And that's where like diversity and everything comes in. Uh, in conversations about diversity, people always talk about, oh, make sure you're around the table, you have different people around the table. But let's not even talk about the table. How do people even get in the room, let alone get around the table? And once they're at the table, how do they actually have the power to do anything about anything at the table? Because there's no point being in a room, no point being at a table when you have no power given to you to do anything about it. Then it is once again just performative. Having women or women of color or people with disabilities or anything around the room, around the table, doesn't mean anything unless they have any agency to do anything or say anything. And that's the thing. So women in AI, um, there's all these amazing organizations around the world like Women in AI, Women in Data Science, Women of AI. There's just so many. I was involved in Women in AI, and then I went and co-founded with fantastic Toju Juke, Diverse AI, which is around diversity in AI. You know, the humanity is rich and diverse, and if we really want to create technologies that can, benefit everyone, we need to ensure that that diversity is represented in decisions at all levels, and actually actively participating or co-creating as opposed to just being consulted, when decisions are already made.
Yeah, sometimes you're not consulted, you're just informed or you
Yeah,
figure it out
yeah, you're at the
when
bottom of that
something
racing
is
matrix, right?
happening.
Like,
Yeah, yeah, I know.
informed. Kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah. And I know we are also kind of coming up on time. So when you look ahead, let's say 1 to 2 years from now, or even 3 to 5 years from now, let's say if a company or a community or a public institution wants to move beyond ethical AI principles into real accountability, bringing real communities into the discussion, and also data ownership in terms of some of the communities where you said the data is owned by the community and the model is owned by them, right? Instead of someone else who has no idea about that. So, what would you suggest as some of the structural changes they must make if a company wants to move beyond ethical AI into real accountability, really implementing it?
Oh, that's deep. I mean, at the end of the day, acknowledging that data has provenance. Data is, it's not free, and how do for starters, the entire data and AI world is full of extraction and
Mm,
exploitation. So
yeah,
it's not just about the use, it's about the actual like journey from supplier to user, and and the creation of these technologies. I think for starters, everyone just needs to be far more empowered with knowledge around all this so that you can make better decisions, informed decisions. But in terms of an organization, it depends what product you make, right? If you're trying to develop a product that possibly has no impact on humans, then that's cool, right? That's okay. Just and then it's about how do your ethical and sustainability kind of policies play. How does it align? Do you know where your data is from? Is it representative? Even if it's not to do with humans, you need to make sure that it is the right kind of data, because I think in the world of data and AI, data is king. They like to say
data is key.
oil,
Yeah.
all those metaphors kind of thing. But I always find data is the new oil quite funny because we've all concluded oil is not good for the planet. So
It's
why
the
are we
same
using
way.
that metaphor? But it is that whole thing that data is everyone's, and there are limitations to data, and I think that's the real key thing companies need to realize, because what's not represented is as important as what is represented. And also remember, sometimes data measures the wrong thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
And it may have missing data also.
yeah,
Doesn't
I mean,
mean
there's the
data
missing
didn't
data. What's
exist.
not there
Yeah.
is just as important, but it's remembering that it could be measuring the wrong thing. um
Mm,
and and if you're making decisions based on that, then that's a problem.
yeah.
The whole, a lot of the stories of the whole, the crime predictive policing stuff in the US, that they're making predictions on crime based on arrests, but
Mm,
arrests aren't necessarily the indicator for a crime having been committed, right? So you're measuring the wrong thing. And like the healthcare scandal, the whole using healthcare spend as a proxy for healthcare need. And you're like,
mm,
yeah, but in vastly unequal societies where, communities of color can't spend as much on healthcare, that's not indicative of their healthcare need. They have the same healthcare need, they just can't afford it, right? So
yeah.
so if you're purely determining that based on healthcare spend, you're going to get the wrong analysis. And it's people understanding that data is great, but it has limitations, and you have to use it in that way. But in terms of, an organization wanting to move from ethical principles to ethical action, it there's no one size fits all. I think that's the most important thing. Acknowledging that there's different considerations depending on the stakes of what you are developing, right? If you're creating a recommender engine for, a song or something, that's so different to creating an algorithm that will identify whether someone has cancer. They're completely different things, completely different, situations, regulations, legal, considerations, and life or death stakes behind it, right? If someone gets recommended the wrong song, it's not the end of the world. But if you tell someone they have cancer, or tell them they don't have cancer when they do, based on the product that you've developed on a faulty algorithm, or based on, biased data or incomplete data, that has huge repercussions. And so it's kind of understanding that there isn't a one size fits all to this. Is that you need to be very considered and intentional, and kind of deliberate, and do your due diligence on what you're trying to build, or what you're trying to deploy, or what you want to use it for, etc.
Yeah, I mean, like you rightly mentioned, missing data, measuring the wrong thing, biased data, they are all key indicators as to what you're developing. And sometimes it has harmful effects, right? It's not as easy or simple as recommending the wrong song, right? So
Mhm.
there are a lot of implications in terms of not just physical well-being, mental well-being, but also societal benefit, how the future generation is being supported, and so many other things. And also, like you rightly mentioned, it's really important to think through the balance of efficiency, productivity, with what can we continue to do to keep our humanity alive, right? So thanks so much, Steph. We can keep talking for a long time, but I think we are kind of at time. Is there one last takeaway that you want to share with our audience, and then we'll continue to wrap up?
Phew, I guess it's you all have a choice. We all have a choice. We all have a say. We all have power. Claim it, use it, and acknowledge that we are in a privileged position, and use that privilege to make things better for everybody, and look beyond our own little world, because I think, we could create a new future, a different world where the priority is helping people and
Yeah.
and making everyone's lives better, instead of the few. I'll end with a quote from Rachel Caldecott, my colleague at Hopeful. She's created the Society of Hopeful Technologists, and but once she delivered a keynote at one of our events, and she had this slide, which is she's got T-shirts as well. Make AI work for 8 billion people and not 8 billionaires. So so
That's
let's
so
go for that.
profound. Yeah, yeah, very profound. Yeah, like I mean, I couldn't agree more. It's such a powerful statement, and also you don't have to do it alone. The choices, the reimagining, and the overcoming the inevitable, because you can lean on communities like your community, our AI collective, and lean on communities like mine, Women in AI, and so many other communities that you can rely on to educate and become aware and see how you can make small choices in your daily lives, right? Thanks so much, Steph, for sharing your expertise with us. And thanks everyone for spending your time with us today. I appreciate the thoughtful perspectives shared by Steph. If you'd like to continue the discussion, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with Steph on LinkedIn. We are here. Our communities are always happy to engage offline, respond to questions, or hear suggestions on topics and voices you'd like to see featured. I host these Women in AI conversations once a month, bringing together global experts on ethical AI, culture, policy, and leadership. Please keep an eye out for next month's topic and guest, and do sign up when registrations open up. Thank you again for joining us and for being part of this global dialogue. And thanks again, Steph, for joining us and sharing your time with us.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.